Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to session number 2, Global Agricultural and Industrial Subsidies. In this session, we have 3 presentations. The first one by Anna Strutt from University of Waikato. She will be presenting the GTAP domestic support, or the so-called GTAP-DS model. After Anna's presentation, we will have a discussion, and then we will transition to the next presentation by Kim Anderson, who will present the relative importance of global agricultural subsidies and market access revisited. After Kim's presentation, we will have another 10-minute discussion and then transition to the next presentation by Beatriz Velazquez, who will be presenting industrial subsidies affecting the economy, the case of trade between China and the EU. And then after Beatriz's presentation, we'll have discussion, and then we will close the session after. Since we have 3 presentations in this session, we can have more discussion. We have room for more discussion towards the end, so we can extend the session a bit if needed. Okay, without further ado, then Anna, if you could share your screen and start your presentation. I will be timing and letting you know if you're close to the time allotted, which is 20 minutes.
Thanks, Erwin. How's that? Is that working okay?
Yes, it is. Okay, perfect.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. And thank you, those of you who have joined us very early in the morning for some like Erwin, and late at night for people like Kim and I and everybody else all around the world. Missing seeing people in person, but great to still at least be able to connect online. So this paper is on a little project that Kim and Erwin and I started working on last year. Well, we thought it was quite a small project at the time. We thought it was going to be quite a straightforward thing, but the more we got into it, the more we realized that we had to do a lot of work to fix up problems, to do things better and so on. So we didn't anticipate needing this GTAP-DS model, but as we worked more and more on domestic support, we realized that some improvements and some changes were needed to the GTAP model and also to the data. So we're going to introduce this, this GTAP-DS model, which is a new one. And then Kim will be following on in the second presentation. He'll be using it in a slightly different way. So the outline of what I'll cover in this presentation will give you a little bit of background and context to the work, and then an introduction to this new GTAP-DS or domestic support model. Then we'll take a look at some simulations to show what difference it makes to the results when we implement these changes, and then just briefly mention some of the future directions that we plan to take this work. We give you a little bit of background to the studies. The economic effects of domestic agricultural subsidies will differ by country and commodity. So a CGE model like GTAP is ideal for capturing the impacts, both within a country, those movements between sectors, and also between countries. So when one country changes its domestic support, how that impacts prices and the shifts that causes in the country itself, but also in other countries. So CGE modelling is ideal for this sort of work, but there are a number of challenges, and as I alluded to at the beginning of this presentation, a number of challenges that we weren't expecting. In this study, what we did is we develop an augmented version of the GTAP model, and we also make some changes to the GTAP database, which better equips the model and the database to look at the impacts of removing domestic agricultural subsidies. So the contributions of this particular paper, I think we make 2 main contributions in this area. The first is that we believe we improve the current net tax specification in the GTAP model. So what we do is we split subsidy and tax wedges which avoids the problem of taxes and subsidies being combined. It may not be clear to you what the problem is yet, but as we go through the presentation, I'll explain this problem in a little bit more detail. But basically, the standard GTAP model is combining taxes and subsidies, so it's difficult to just hit the subsidies by themselves. So we improve that tax specification in GTAP, allowing us to target the subsidies directly. And the other contribution that this paper makes is that we recalibrate some of the domestic support in the GTAP database to better target the OECD data on which it draws. So the GTAP database draws on OECD data, but what we found is that sometimes it wasn't really matching those target rates. It wasn't matching the OECD data very well. So we did do some work in that area as well. Then what we'll do is we'll highlight some of the differences that these two changes make to simulation results. So any of you working in this area who are undertaking simulations with GTAP will give you an idea of the sort of difference that it might make if you incorporate these innovations in your work. So the GTAP-DS database, we're actually using the GTAP version 11 pre-release 3, and those of you who are data contributors and board members who have access to this will know just how fresh this database is, because of course it only arrived in our inboxes a couple of days ago, so these are very fresh results. But we thought it was important because we wanted to test with the 2017 baseline data, which will be the version 11 data. We know that there are sometimes issues with pre-release data, but we wanted to start working with this pre-release data. And I think, you know, one thing that we found was there was actually a big difference between pre-release 2 and pre-release 3 when it came to the tariffs. Not quite so important for this particular presentation, but it will be important when it gets to Kim's presentation that we're using the most up-to-date version. We run with quite a big aggregation. We've actually got 56 regions and 30 sectors, a particular focus on agricultural and food sectors. With this GTAP pre-release 3 database, we supplement it with the OECD agricultural support data. The GTAP database, of course, already draws on the OECD ag support data, but we build on some previous work we did last year, which highlighted some issues with factor subsidies not really working out quite the way that we might have expected by the time they were implemented in the standard GTAP database. So the GTAP domestic support model, the GTAP-DS, in this model, we modify the GTAP model code to separate subsidies from taxes. This enables us to directly target reductions in subsidies, and it avoids the problem that net subsidies can sometimes include some taxes, and some subsidies might be hidden in net taxes. So in a standard GTAP model, the way that it tends to work is people would be targeting what look like subsidies, but they're actually net subsidies, and they might be hiding some taxes. So what we try to do is to separate them out so that we can really target those subsidies directly. The changes cover all of the equations where the agricultural subsidy measures are identified in the GTAP database. This includes factor subsidies, intermediate input subsidies, and also output or production subsidies. But at the moment, because it turns out to be a bit more time consuming than we thought, particularly for Erwin, who's been doing the code on this, we've only implemented this change for the factor subsidies. So the change for intermediate inputs and output subsidies is still in process. If we look at domestic distortions in the GTAP database, factor endowment subsidies, those of you familiar with the notation might be familiar with this FBEP. They are available separately from factor taxes in the GTAP database, which is notated FTRV. So if you've been looking at the GTAP database, you will have seen perhaps these two components. And also in the GTAP database, we have got net intermediate inputs and output subsidies, but the gross tax values for those headers aren't included. So when we're looking at intermediate input and output subsidies, This is going to require some extra work to separate out domestic support and the IO table, intermediate input and output tax flows in the data file. This is in progress. So as mentioned before, we haven't yet fully implemented the split of subsidies and taxes for intermediates and output subsidies. But let's talk about the factor subsidies, which is where we have done the most work at the moment. Factor subsidies are by far the most important of the OECD subsidies integrated into GTAP. So hopefully we're capturing a lot of the important changes that are needed by focusing on factor subsidies first. Factor subsidies contribute more than 70% of the total value of OECD subsidies that are included in the GTAP database. So if we add up all of those subsidies, the factor subsidies are comprising the bulk of the values. But in the model code, in the standard GTAP model code, these factor subsidies are combined as a difference between producer and basic prices, and this includes both subsidies and taxes. So again, if you're familiar with the notation, it would be that E-tax, which is a difference between producer and basic prices. The traditional way of modelling cuts to these subsidies seems to have been to assume that E-tax is a subsidy if it ends up negative and eliminate those. So if you end up with E-tax being negative, assume it's a subsidy and eliminate that if you're trying to eliminate subsidies. But as mentioned, the subsidies may be hidden in net taxes, and net subsidies can be dampened by taxes because we've only got that one overall measure. So it's not a very accurate means of eliminating all subsidies. We're going to overshoot and undershoot in some of these subsidies. So what we did is we split the factor subsidies and the taxes in the model code, allowing us to be much more accurate in our shocks and to run simulations that really do only cut the subsidies without touching the factor taxes. The changes made to the model code are here. You can see that we, or perhaps if I point to this bottom one down here that many of you will be familiar with if you're GTAP users, this TFE, I guess, is the variable that you would often hit if you're trying to get rid of subsidies in the GTAP database. But we've actually broken it down here into two components, the subsidy and the tax component, so that we can target each of them separately. And what that allows us to do is leave any taxes in place while we're eliminating the subsidies. So after looking at the model code, let's turn to what we did to improve the factor subsidies in the GTAP database. As mentioned, they are in the GTAP database, they are available separately. But what we found is that there were a few problems when we started looking at these data, and this little guy here is one of the problems that we found. Not this particular guy, I think this guy is a New Zealand sheep actually, and it wasn't the New Zealand sheep that were the problem, it was a European sheep that turned out to be the really major problem in the database. So let's take a look at what we found. Well, we modify a GTAP database issue that led to an overstatement of wool subsidies in the EU, a really significant overstatement of wool subsidies in the EU. This large subsidy on EU wool arises from the way that other transfer payments that come from the OECD database, these OTPs, are applied across GTAP sectors. And these OTPs are a large value. So the way that they're applied across GTAP sectors can really make quite a big difference. They're not specific to any sector. So of course, to implement them in GTAP, some assumptions have to be made. But it turned out that the assumptions made in standard GTAP were applying a lot of subsidies to the wool sector, which wasn't credible. In the current GTAP database, OTP is allocated using factor shares of each of the 12 ag sectors to total factor use in agriculture within each country. So this is the way that it's implemented in the current version of the GTAP database. But once we realized that we weren't really getting the right subsidies in the database, Erwin and Anhal put their heads together on this. And thanks very much, Anhal, a big shout out to you, because it was Anhal who suggested this normalizing of the factor use by the share of output implementing that step first, so having a two-step procedure, and then using these normalized values in the calculation, which ended up giving much, much more credible subsidy flows in the database. If we compare the original and the new method of distributing these OTPs, in the original way of distributing domestic subsidies, a sector like wool could still get a large payment allocation, even if its production data was small, if that OTP was large enough, which it was in a region like the European Union. In the alternative method, the allocation for small sectors like wool stays low because it's further scaled by factor use. So for example, if the GTAP output value was $40 million, if the pay rate in the original method was 11.6, then you end up with a total subsidy value of 464 million. So you end up with a subsidy much, much larger than that 40 million value of output. In the alternative, the pay rate might end up at 0.9. So the subsidy value ends up as 36 million, so certainly less than the value of output. This particular example is taken from an older version of what was happening with wool. In the GTAP database, only the domestic support rates are preserved, and the rates are based on processed OECD domestic support data multiplied by the GTAP's VOM or value of output at market prices. So if this value of output in GTAP is large enough compared to the OECD estimates, then the subsidy values are further magnified. So there's a further potential problem that can kick in there as well. When we implemented this adjustment to factor subsidies, a rebuild of the GTAP database was required. We couldn't have achieved it through shocking the wool subsidy under an outer tax closure. It was just much, much too big a shock to try to do through something like outer tax. So luckily, Erwin was able to do this with some assistance from Untitled. When we use the alternative approach, the wool subsidies in the EU reduce significantly. It also has an impact on other sectors, although a much smaller impact on other sectors. The overall impact is that total EU subsidies in the GTAP database end up much closer to the original OECD values. And if we summarize, if we show what happened to wool, on the left-hand side, we've got the original subsidy that was going to wool in the GTAP database, which is more than $30 billion US, which is a large subsidy. In the alternative method, we end up with almost nothing going to the EU. The UK is a much smaller problem, but we did still do an adjustment for the EU as well. So essentially, we got rid of this $30 billion subsidy to wool in the EU. So let's have a look at what impact it makes. These changes that we made to the model code, allowing us to directly target subsidies, and the changes that we made to the database. We've got three scenarios that hopefully will give you a feel for what this does to results. The first scenario is where we're using, I should have said version 11. GTAP model is version 7. So that's version 11 pre-release 3. Sorry for that typo. So we use the version 11 pre-release 3 database where we've done the adjustments to the model code and to the primary factor. So that's our first scenario. So I guess this is our best current bet. The second scenario is we're going to show you what would happen to our results if we had left the database as it is in the standard GTAP database with those high subsidies on EU wool, for example. And then the third scenario is designed just to show the impact of separating the primary factor subsidies and taxes in the data in the model code. So in this scenario 3, we haven't got those large subsidies on wool. We're using the adjusted database, but we're showing the impacts of this change in the model code. So let's have a look at these three scenarios and see what happens to results. Take a quick look at GDP and welfare, and then we'll turn to sectoral results, including global prices and exports. I guess these are still exploratory results at the moment. They're very fresh and they will change a little bit once we move to the final version of the GTAP database. But hopefully it will give you a feel for what's happening. Okay, over here, if we take a look over here on the right-hand side, this is the total impact on GDP of eliminating subsidies in agricultural products. So eliminating global subsidies in agricultural products. This blue bar is our augmented model and database. And the total impact on global GDP is about $4.3 billion of gains in global GDP. If we compare that with the grey bar, which is where we're using the updated data, but we're also splitting the taxes and subsidies, so we directly target the subsidies, it's almost the same. It was really disappointing when we first saw this, all of the work that went into the coding and the thinking through how to do this, and the total global impact. I think, there's only a few $1 million worth of difference. That's at the global level, but what happens at the global level is I think that some of these net taxes and subsidies are kind of balancing each other out, and we actually find that we get a lot of detail once you dig below this global level. So disappointing at first glance, but it really got quite interesting when we looked at the more detailed results. But I guess the result that really shows through here is this impact. The orange bar, if we use the standard GTAP database, we get an extra almost $21 billion worth in gains in global GDP if we'd left that large wool subsidy in. So it makes a huge difference to the global results. And if you look at the decomposition, these are factor subsidies, intermediates and outputs. It's all driven by these factor subsidies and pretty much by the EU wool. If we turn to look at regional welfare results, what we find there is, the orange bars again are where we've got that wool problem. And the EU gets a lot of welfare out of the simulation, whereas once we get rid of the wool problem, the global gains, the EU gains in welfare come right down to this blue bar. Just a little bit different if we've got that correct targeting of the subsidies and taxes. So the world results, that big height of the orange bar is really very much driven by the wool problem. Once we get rid of this, we've got kind of more subtle differences in some ways between the grey and the blue bars, but there's still quite significant differences. In fact, if you look at a region like North America, the difference caused by that changes in factors and subsidies, the better coding there, does lead to some results even at the aggregate regional level. When we turn to look at the impact at the sectoral level and the impact on world export prices, that orange bar again is shown where we've got the wool problem in place, and we've clearly got a big difference in wool prices in that simulation compared to our other simulations. But otherwise, the orange fairly closely tracks the blue, which is our updated domestic support model and database. So apart from wool, it pretty much closely tracks the blue. However, if we look at this domestic support data where we fix the data, but we're using the standard GTAP model, that is, we're only hitting the net subsidies rather than actually targeting subsidies directly, which is this grey line here, you can see that there's a consistent difference in prices of world exports between that grey line and the blue line, and in some cases a very significant difference. So for example, in fruit and veg, we've got the price effect being close to 3 times what it is if we use the standard GTAP model. So when we looked at these results, I guess we started to think that yes, although it didn't have changing the model code didn't have a big impact on global GDP, it certainly makes a really big impact at the sectoral level. And that also shows through if we look at global real exports, we see some differences between the grey and the blue bars when we look at those global exports. So I think I'm probably running low on time here, so perhaps I'll just move straight to my final slide. So where to from here with this work? The first thing we're going to do is complete the model updates. We want to get those intermediate and output subsidies split the same way that we're currently doing with factor subsidies, and also there's some data splitting that I mentioned that also needs to be done. What this will allow us to do is to track the economic implications associated with changes in agricultural domestic support subsidies alone. So we'll be able to directly target those subsidies while we're maintaining any taxes that might be in place. So we've got rid of that kind of masking problem of the taxes. And also we're able to hit those subsidies that might have previously been masked by a tax. So we'll be completing those model updates. We will, of course, be updating to GTAP-11 because this is still exploratory simulations using pre-release data. So we'll be moving to GTAP-11 with the 2017 database, and we'll be doing a number of further checks trying to ensure that we're getting as much comparability as possible with the original OECD data that's feeding into this domestic support. And then our intention will be to make the model and data revisions available to other researchers. Perhaps the data revision might even be available in the public release of GTAP-11, but I guess that's yet to be seen. Erwin can comment on that if he wishes, but that would certainly be our hope, that the data, a revised approach to doing subsidies, become a standard in the GTAP database, but the model, that model code that we've been implemented is used by people who really want to focus on targeting domestic subsidies. And that's it for me. So thanks very much for your interest in the presentation, and look forward to any comments.
Okay, thank you, Anna, for that great presentation. We now open the floor for questions. If you have questions or clarifications, you can, since we have time, you can unmute yourself and then ask a question if you wish. Okay, Pierre, perfect.
Thank you, Erwin. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Anna, for the presentation. Very, very interesting. So my name is Pierre, just to put in the context, and I contributed with colleague Georges Philippidis and Hani Hansen for the domestic support of the European Union. And it's true that we had some conversation with Angel on how to better allocate the OTP support especially for the European Union, because most of the OTP are decoupled payments. And then to couple the OTP to the output, for us, it was counterintuitive, because by definition, being decoupled, these payments are not allocated to any specific commodity. So that's why in our conversation, we were more keen to couple to physical land area, and then pondering by commodity and EU country. That it would better reflect the nature of decoupled payment. But it's true that the allocation of OTP for the EU is very difficult, and what you're proposing, I think it's interesting solution. But again, and even with the new CAP, where decoupled payment will be even more important, I don't have the exact number, but I would say that it would be about 60% of the CAP budget. I'm not sure about this, but it's a lot. So did you, my question, so did you check to try to face different allocation of OTP? That means either the traditional one, either the one to output, and the one just to land, because by definition, decoupled payments are coupled to land. So this, it would be, I have another question, but I think this one, I will stay on this one, and maybe to hear Anna on this. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Maybe I can make a brief response and then ask Erwin to make a more detailed response, because it was really him working on the data. So thanks very much, Pierre, for coming along, and thanks, of course, for your work in this area, which you'll have seen your name cited on one of our slides. It's a really difficult area, isn't it? How this OTP, it's got to be allocated somewhere in the database. So we're very sympathetic to the problems that and certainly as we started digging into it, we understood the difficulty in trying to allocate it. But I guess where we came out is that the current way that it's implemented just isn't credible. So something has to change, because we can't be leaving this huge $30 billion subsidy on EU wool. So perhaps there's room for conversation about whether what we're doing at the moment is exactly the best way, but I think it's certainly an improvement. It's moving closer to the OECD data. I guess what sometimes happens, and this went through our minds as we were working on it, is there was so much about the methodology that was sensible and correct and so on, but of course by the time it gets implemented through the database, there's these unexpected problems that emerge, and you end up with an output that just is not consistent with the inputs that went in. So yeah, I mean, thanks very much for your insights, and we certainly look forward to talking more with you about it. But Erwin, do you want to comment? Because I know you were probably thinking much more carefully about this allocation than I was.
Yeah. First of all, thank you, Pierre. When I saw your name pop in on my screen, I was really glad that you joined in the session. So in the allocation, we only tried the alternative method that Anna showed, but we didn't think about the land allocation that you mentioned. But we'll do that as a third alternative. And if you don't mind, we'll coordinate with you as well, so that we can ask for comments and suggestions from you as we implement different allocation methodologies, and then we can test it out and see what happens. Okay, thank you. Mike?
Thanks. I'm Mike Bourne from DEFRA, the UK's Ministry of the Environment and Agriculture and other things. Really interesting and presentation, thank you. And I'm really interested in this work. A couple of quick questions, I think. On the allocation thing, I know previous iterations or other iterations of the GTAP model have a kind of agricultural, I'm thinking about land use and the kind of non-commodity specific nature of the decoupled payment, and whether there's any room for, maybe you're already doing this and I've just misunderstood, but essentially having the payment, it has an initial allocation, but then it kind of remains regardless of which agricultural commodity is produced. But that might, I don't know if that makes any sense. But my other question is, I think that one of the big areas of interest in this work would be on land use implications. So I was wondering if there were any plans to combine it with GTAP-AEZ in the future. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks very much for those comments. Are there any plans to combine it with AEZ? Well, I think the aim would be that the model is sort of developed in modules, so that this module for domestic support, I can see Erwin's nodding his head, this is certainly his idea, is that there are modules that can be turned on and off. So hopefully longer term, what we can have is we can have like an AEZ module, we can have a domestic support module, and then researchers can use those modules that are relevant for what they're focusing on. I mean, if researchers aren't doing anything on domestic subsidies, there's no need for them to have this module that we're doing here. But of course, if you're doing domestic subsidies, it would be really beneficial, I think, to be able to hit those subsidies directly. If that's, I guess researchers often thought that was what they were doing when they were hitting what looked like a subsidy in a database, without necessarily realizing that it's actually a subsidy with any taxes that might have been in place taken off. So it's one of those things that you can see why people do it, but it's probably, there's probably a better way of doing it. So I think absolutely that's a sensible way to go ahead and do it. In terms of your first comment, and I guess I was trying to think through, and again, Erwin might want to make some more comments. I guess that the struggle is that when you've got these payments that are not assigned to any particular sector, within the GTAP modelling framework, we've somehow got to assign them to something. So we've everything's got to be pinned down in the GTAP modelling framework. And I don't think that there's some way that we can have them sort of loosely left as just an overall subsidy to whichever sector is going to grab it. It needs to be allocated to subsidy to a sector. And Erwin, and for that matter, Pierre, actually might want to make some comments on that perhaps afterwards, because this would be something that you would have thought about a lot, Pierre, when you were doing that initial work. Erwin, did you want to comment at all?
No, not perfect. Yeah, I just on the modularization. Yes, we'll put it as a modular part of the model, so that you can just turn it on and off whenever you need to, and put it in as part of the AEZ. Yeah.
We've got a bit more work to do first. As mentioned, it turned out to be a lot bigger job than we were expecting. But I mean, I guess it's always the way, but we were surprised. But it was it was great, and we had a perfect team with Erwin working on the database and Kim's knowledge of domestic support. So we were able to sort of really dig into these things, but we've kept going a lot longer than the original project because it seemed like there was more work to do. So we'd be certainly happy and very interested to talk to others who are interested in this area in trying to, further develop it.
Yeah. Okay, unless there is a burning question, we'll now transition to the next speaker or presenter, who is Kim Anderson from University of Adelaide, who will be presenting the relative importance of global agricultural subsidies and market access revisited. Kim?
Good, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to all the listeners there as well. This work directly follows on from Anna's presentation. She has given you a background to the complications of trying to better represent domestic support for agriculture in the GTAP model. The use that we made of this back in the early days of the Doha round, when we were at the World Bank, Ernesto Valenzuela was there with us, and Tom Patel as well. And we worked with Will Martin on looking at the importance of agricultural liberalisation with
It looks like we have a technical problem. Looks like Kim dropped out, but we'll wait a bit. I'm sure he will join us and then share his presentation again. Well, while we wait for Kim, are there any other questions for Anna's presentation? Oh, hi, Kim. You're muted, Kim. You're muted. There you go.
There we go. Is that better?
Yes.
Can you hear me now? Sorry. Just
we can hear you
faded
now.
out there for a bit. Very good.
Yeah.
Okay. So since 2001, when we were first looking at this, the outlawing of export subsidies has now happened, and but we've still got domestic subsidies, and they seem to be growing in quite a few countries, including developing ones. And the annual value of the overall government support to agriculture hasn't fallen over these past 2 decades in dollar terms.
Kim,
and of course, there's been some retreat from globalization.
Your presentation is not showing. If you could share your presentation, or maybe if Anna could put it, could share it while Kim was, or while Kim is talking, if it's better for the connection.
see you again.
I've got it here, Kim, if you want me to do a share screen.
Okay, I don't know why it keeps fading in and out. Sorry, I'm trying to find out the... So it's not showing at the moment?
No.
No.
I'll do a share screen and you can just direct.
Okay.
Seem to work my end. Oh, sorry, am I on the wrong share screen? Sorry, let me close that presentation. That's all good now, is it, Erwin?
Yes, perfect.
Yep. Kim, is that the slide you want to start on?
I can't see that, unfortunately. Oh, there we go. Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yep, perfect.
Ah, very good. Okay. So I can even move this, can I? No, you'll have to move it for me.
You'll have to say a command when you
Okay, so if you move up, thanks. Next one. Okay, the next one. So that's those flat lines you can see there are showing the share of exports in value added in the different sectors, manufacturing on the top and agriculture on the bottom. So clearly there has been this cessation really in the openingness of the world economy. So that made it interesting to try and look at this picture, this story again 2 decades later. And so that's the purpose of this paper. Next slide. There's been lots of scope still for countries to support their farmers, and we've done some work on that with Anno back in 2016, and so have others at IFPRI and elsewhere to look at how these subsidies and tariffs could rise in many countries under current WTO obligations. And so again, there's this risk that there could be increases in distortions to agriculture in the years to come. So looking at where we're at now is important. Next slide, thanks. So the 2 questions we look at here are firstly, specifically on agriculture, what are the global GDP or welfare costs of agricultural policies, and how are they shared between import restrictions and domestic support? And how is that split between high-income country policies versus developing country policies? So we're going to look at this for 2017 using the database Anna just described, and then compare it with the results from the 2001 GTAP database. And the second question then is to go beyond that and look at what's agriculture's contribution to the global welfare costs of all trade measures. Thanks, Anna. Next one. So a little bit on the modelling, although Anna's given us a great introduction to that. So it's just using the GTAP model, a slide or two on the literature review, and then presenting interim results. These are definitely interim results. They came in yesterday. And as Anna explained, there is still work to be done on the domestic support database. And ultimately, we'll be using the version 3 public release, but we're using the early version of that version 3 of number 11. Okay, thanks, Anna. So it's, of course, drawing on the OECD data, but also what's in the agincentives.org database. Those are going into the GTAP database on agricultural tariffs and subsidy equivalents. So I'll show you what those are in a moment, and then we'll look at, compare that baseline with a simulation in which, first of all, we remove agricultural domestic subsidies, domestic support part, and then remove them in addition to agricultural import restrictions, the tariffs. in order to answer that first question I mentioned, specifically on agricultural policies. And then we also remove all the non-agricultural import tariffs globally to answer that second question as to how important are agricultural policies in overall overall trade distortions at the current time or in 2017. Next slide. So I mentioned the work with Will Martin. I'm glad to see you're online, Will. Thanks for joining us. That work was published in 2006 in World Trade Review. But there's been more recently some work, Voice and Urban, etc., have a paper in the JAE that specifically focuses on the composition of domestic support, to the degree to which some of that is decoupled from production, for example, and have tried to look at that. They only focus on the EU, though, and they're using much older databases, the 24 and 2007 ones. The work I did with Ernesto a year or so ago was for the Australian government, wanting to know how Australian farmers were adversely affected by the rest of the world's agricultural subsidies and comparing them with tariffs. But we also added New Zealand and Brazil just to look at those by comparison. They turned out to be the three most adversely affected countries from these global agricultural subsidies. But that was using the 2014 database. So here we are updating to 2017 and generalising that AJAR paper to look at the impact for all countries. Thanks, Anna. So there's five sets of results here I'll focus on sequentially. The first one is to look at what the subsidy and tariff rates are in this modified GTAP database for 2017, and then look at these next questions one by one. So Hannah, the next slide will show us those rates of subsidy and tariffs. So you can see there how large these subsidies are, more than 10% on average across the high-income countries, the domestic support programs, and they contrast with the tariffs, which are averaging only about 2% when we include all the processed food sector as well. That brings it down quite a bit, of course. And then the black line there is the tariffs for non-agricultural and food commodities. So for high-income countries, those two tariff rates are similar and are very small compared with the farm subsidy rates. In developing countries, all three are fairly equal at about 4%. So the subsidies are much smaller there than in high-income countries, but the tariffs are much larger, both for agricultural and for non-agricultural products in developing versus high-income countries. Thanks, Emma. And here you can see those subsidies and tariffs for individual products in the set there. You can see the contrast. Cotton, for example, is almost entirely supported by domestic subsidies, whereas sugar is almost entirely supported by tariffs. But wheat is a mixture of the two, and so on. So it varies a lot across products and certainly across countries as well. So it's a very mixed bag. Thanks, Anna. Okay, to this second question then, which is looking at the effects of these removing the subsidies and the tariffs on net farm incomes in different countries. And you can see this massive spread here. Obviously, the highly subsidising countries are on the right, Switzerland and Japan and the EU, for example. And on the left are the TENS group type countries, lightly subsidising ones of New Zealand and Costa Rica and Argentina and Australia. And I took out the countries in the middle there that only have a small impact. But these are, this is showing for New Zealand, for example, that net farm incomes would be 20% higher in that country if all those agricultural subsidies and tariffs on agricultural and food goods were removed. The next slide, Anna, that shows if we look at it just for the agricultural subsidies themselves, because that's what a lot of the focus of negotiating has been over the last year or so, just looking at the subsidies and not wanting to worry about tariffs. We'll see how sensible that is in a little while. But clearly it's a similar sort of spread of countries, with the Cairns Group type countries on the left and the highly protective European countries on the right. Next slide. The next question is, when we get there, is looking at the contribution of high-income countries and developing countries' policies to those gains that would come from full agricultural liberalisation. The next slide has a nice table that summarises that. So the subsidies, this is just the subsidies themselves, are contributing about $53 billion to world welfare costs at the moment, but a small part of that, only $4 billion, is due to subsidies, and most of the rest is due to tariffs. So that's the breakdown there also between high-income countries and developing countries. So the right-hand black column is telling us that virtually all the gains to each of these two groups of countries comes from their own policy reforms, 90-something%. The next slide, Anna, tells us how much of that, we can see it in the right-hand column there anyway, how much of that subsidy, how much of that is coming from subsidy removal? Well, it turns out only about 8%. You might recall our work back in the 2006 suggested it was about 5%. We can go on to the next one, Anna. It's crept up to about 8%, and it'll be interesting to see how much more it might change as Erwin and Anna finish this work on disaggregating domestic support. But currently it's only 8% that is coming from that. That means the rest is coming from tariffs. So this focus by negotiators on just the subsidies in agriculture means we're only touching a very small fraction of the distortions in global food and agricultural markets. Okay, so the next slide is looking at the contribution to of those agricultural policies to the global cost of all trade distorting policies. And the subsidies component is the first row, the agricultural tariffs is the second row, and then the non-agricultural tariffs is the third row. So of this total, it's about $150 billion a year is the cost of all of these trade distorting policies, both agricultural and non-agricultural. That's about half of the sorts of numbers we were getting a decade or so ago in doing this type of work with a comparative static model. So it suggests that distortions globally have come down a lot, but the split between developing and high-income countries of that $150 billion is very much larger for developing countries now than was previously the case. But agricultural policies back in the earlier work were contributing 60 to 65% of the cost of global trade distortions. Now it's only 35%, that number in the final column. So there's a big reduction in the extent to which agricultural policies are contributing to the cost of trade distortions globally, according to these interim numbers. We'll see if they change much when we finish this work. And the developing countries themselves, they previously contributed back a decade or so to about 45% of the global cost. Their policies were impacting bringing in nearly half of that cost. Now they're bringing in 70%. So that's the difference that's showing up at the moment. Next slide, thanks, Anna. Okay, so that's the summary of these numbers. The first point was that the cost currently of these programs is about half what it was back in the early part of this century. The contribution of high-income countries' policies to that global cost has dropped from 55% to 30%. That is, developing countries have gone from 45% to 70%. and the contribution of the agricultural policies to the cost of all trade-related policies was 63% back there in our study anyway. It's now only 35% of it being due to agricultural policies. And finally, the contribution of developing country agricultural policies to the global cost of agricultural policies was only about a quarter back earlier this century. Now it's about a half. So these numbers are very different from what we had before. And of course, when you look at it at the country level, you'll see differences there as well. So it'll be interesting to finish this work off once the database is completely redone, and we'll look forward to sharing these with people. Next slide. Thanks, Anna. So where we go from here is to repeat this with the new database. We're going to project that to 2019, so it's just before COVID, because by then we will have the tariff structure for 2019, so we can pop that in there and see. We know that there have been some increases in agricultural subsidies in those past couple of years with the Trump administration, for example, giving US farmers a big boost in their subsidies. So we'll do that, and then we'll look also at the composition of the agricultural domestic support programs to see to what extent they're adding to distortions, or maybe they're encouraging public goods that societies want. And we have to think about how to take account of that if they're bringing in ecosystem services that society wishes to see more of. And then finally, this can lead into the work that Will Martin and others have been doing at the World Bank and IFPRI recently on repurposing agricultural support programs so that maybe farmers can be supported more efficiently, and that will provide more wherewithal to do other things that society might like to do with that saving, including looking after the environment. So I'll leave it there, Erwin. Sorry about that staggered presentation, but happy to chat about this with questions and comments from others.
Thank you, Kim. No worries about that. I was happy to give you a bit more time to finish up, but I saw that you're almost done, so so I didn't intervene anymore. Okay, well, let's now open the session for questions. Yes, Will, please.
Yep, great. Thanks, Kim, for a great presentation under difficult circumstances. One question is whether you're planning to bring out the effect of subsidies on versus market support, sorry, about market access on output. If you'll recall, Xin Diao had a paper that found that subsidies were more important than market access back when we did ours. And that was because she was looking at output effects. And this output effect turns out to be really important when you're thinking about environment. So what we found in that work with the bank is that subsidies, because they are, if you think of them at the individual country level, a subsidy is just a stimulus to output, whereas a market access barrier is a stimulus to output accompanied by a tax on demand. So it's not surprising, I think, in retrospect, that the output effects are quite different, but the output effects are quite, are important, especially when you build in the environment linkage. So that's a question of whether you want to look at that output impacts as well as the efficiency impacts. But thanks very much. Great paper.
Very nice point. Thanks, Will. We could certainly obviously do that with the results that come out of the model. So you've given us another reason to expand this paper that will come out. We might have to end up with more than one paper, but that's a great idea. And obviously the environmental consequences of that are something that society focuses on much more now than they used to a few years ago.
All right. Any other question?
Pierre has one.
Pierre, yeah, okay. Pierre, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Kim, for the very interesting presentation. Just to make a link with the presentation of Anna and what we were saying about the OTP. So the OTP, so most of this payment are decoupled payments. And for the European Union, they are conditioned to maintain the land in a good agro-environmental condition. And here there is a positive externality from farming or not, because you can get the support without farming at all, but at least you have to maintain the land, so the land factor in a good condition. So will you consider this element in this in the follow-up of this work? So this would be a first question. And a second question, when you refer, or when we refer to domestic support, we're just focusing on the PSC from the OECD, from the producer support estimate, but there are also the consumer support estimate. And I was thinking that maybe you would address them because you are touching the tax aspect of GTAP. And there is also the increasing GSSE support. So General Services Support Estimate, if I'm right. And here also, there are clear remuneration of positive externalities from the farming activity. So here would be my second question. Will you consider also, as part of the domestic support, the CSC and the GSSE, which are, let's say, a growing support? Thank you.
Thanks, Pierre. Yes, that's an important point. I think it's going to be, it's something the repurposing analysts have been thinking about, I think, trying to work out ways to work with other social scientists and physical scientists and look at the consequences of policies way beyond just the standard things we've looked at, like production, consumption, trade, and some measure of welfare, possibly income distribution as well. But there's clearly all these other effects as well, such as on the environment. And as you say, with the with some of those domestic supports being conditional on changing your local environment, then you are obviously adding something to society which has to be valued somehow, some willingness to pay type measure or whatever. So I think this opens up another huge area where we could stretch this further. As for the consumer subsidies, yes, there are ones in there that are different from those provided just by border measures, and so that could be separated out as well. The border measure is captured in the market access indicator, but as well with these direct consumer subsidies, and they have impacts on prices, etc. as well. The GSSE gets into awkwardness partly because it, as by definition, isn't commodity specific, but some of that is providing national public goods as well. There's spillovers from the agricultural science efforts, for example, into other areas of science. So again, that gives us a lot more to think about, and the group that Will's been working with on repurposing agricultural policies, I'm sure, have been thinking about a lot of those sorts of things. So it's a very exciting new area, I think, for research, for economists that are interested in working with other scientists in this area, including other social scientists.
Yeah, if I may add, the last year or so, we have been collaborating with researchers from University of Minnesota with the Natural Capital Project. So what we did for a recent World Bank report is to link the GTAP-AEZ model with an ecosystem services model called INVEST, wherein we run GTAP and then pass on some results to INVEST, and then INVEST will generate ecosystem impacts, ecosystem services impacts, and then do another GTAP run. We are continuing our collaboration. So the collaboration is continuing. So at some point, I think it would be good for us to expand into that area once at least the database is out, the GTAP database is out. So definitely it's a good room for extension.
Yeah, lots of room for PhD students to get into this.
Okay. Do we have any more questions or comments? All right. Well, thank you, Kim, for that great presentation of yours. We are now transitioning to our next presentation, industrial subsidies affecting the economy, the case of trade between China and EU, and it will be presented by Beatriz Velazquez from DG Trade. Beatriz?
Yes, I'm almost there. I'm going to share my screen now. Can you see it?
It's loading.
Okay. Can you see it now? No? I changed.
There you go.
Okay, good. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you who are interested in subsidies. This presentation, the work we have done together with Alessandro, the Commission is a bit different. It regards industrial subsidies, and the approach is also different because essentially in this area we have mainly an issue of data, at least reliable data, especially for certain countries. Natural subsidies are everywhere, are applied around the world by different countries, but notably the impact of industrial subsidies implemented in China are relevant because it's a huge country. And it's a country with whom the EU has strong links, strong trade links. We trade a lot with. So this work is ongoing. It's something that we started a couple of years ago. We performed this exercise and using two different sources of data and doing a lot of assumptions. We stopped, we gave up the project because we were doing lots of assumptions until the beginning of this year. There was data coming out that could help to reduce the number of assumptions. So we sought to estimate industrial subsidies implemented in China for the first and see what would be the effect, to see the final goal. I would say what is the impact of these subsidies on the EU economy and trade. So the first thing we started doing was to do some estimations using micro data, firm data. And the goal is that of understanding what if China doesn't subsidize, what would be the implications. So my presentation starts with how we calculated those estimates. Then I will illustrate how we model some of the interim results we got in two of the scenarios that we ran, and some reflections after that. As I said, there are not, data is lacking. So our idea was to estimate these support in, I'm talking about the exercise, which is China and EU and subsidies in China. We know that trade defense inquires, investigate subsidies or the impacts on subsidies on industries, and this is done under a legal framework which is provided by the WTO. So we know that countries implement these inquiries, these investigations with a similar approach. There are differences, but it is essentially very similar. Results of these investigations are public, and these investigations are performed by many countries, but some countries in the world, but mostly by a lot of cases are performed in the USA, in the EU, in Australia, in Canada, some in Brazil, and in India. We focused on those for which data was easily available and was up to our capacity to examine this data. And essentially, what we look at are those publications of the results of these investigations where ministries of foreign affairs or the related departments, I can talk about the EU, they perform investigations following a request by an industry. Firms put together and request an investigation because they can prove that imports from certain firms in a certain sector, from China in this case, for a very specific, well-defined product, they are producing injuries. So in these investigations, what the experts do is they look at, they go visit in situ the exporting firms, in this case in China, but they do it for other countries as well. And during these investigations, for each of the firms that are investigated, it is possible to establish what is the injury and what are, they look at books in the firms, what are the contributions that firms receive in terms of financial contribution from the state, from the different level of government in the case of China, and also other transfers to this whole sector, not just to the specific firm, horizontal transfers as well. As a result of the investigation, what it is produced is a countervailing duty that will be applied to import from those industries, from those firms, to counterbalance for the injuries and restore fair trade. We found in the literature, in this book from 2013, that this methodology that we are applying was performed by them, by Haley and Haley, and they assimilated the countervailing duties to import expressed mostly in percentage of trade of import in those cases could be assimilated to subsidies and expressed in a percentage of exports. So what we do, we collected and examined all the investigations available in the last 10, 11 years. This was recently updated up to beginning of 22 of this year in these 4 countries. These investigations are very detailed and the products are defined, even 10 digits in some cases. But the important thing is that they cover a range of sectors. They are in total more than almost 140, 136. And at 6 digits, this implies almost 400 goods. At 7 and 10, these are much, much more. What we got recently and what stimulated us to redo the exercise was that we could get how much of trade, of exports, of China's exports, a share of China's exports at 6 digits by product that is subject to, it's benefiting from subsidies. So we use that share. So we got first percentage of exports, proxy of the percentage of exports by a product at 6 digits. We got how much of Chinese exports are subject to subsidies. And then using the value of Chinese exports, an average again from Comtrade at 6 digits, we obtain a value of a subsidy per line, per good. And then we translated these subsidies into GTAP sectors, into percentage of exports, using weighted average, simply. And what we obtained, we did an average of the countries we have and the sectors. And what we could see is that these subsidies or countervailing duties, in this case, is this by GTAP sectors. They vary a lot. The highest, the ones are those applied to ferrous metals, wood and rubber and plastics and motor vehicles and metal products. One could say that if we count the tariff lines, half of them correspond to metals and metal products, iron and steel and metal products, and the rest is wood and rubber and plastic. But essentially, these are the values and the frequency in numbers. That means that China subsidizes essentially more these sectors than others for which is more competitive. And there you can see that computer electronics and basic pharmaceuticals and other extraction and textiles, for example, apparently China is much more competitive on that. Of course, this is based on our estimates, which could be subject to corrections eventually, because we are covering, as I said, just the parts of those sectors and in those countries that have performed these investigations. But we assume that it is a good proxy. So how we translated these how we introduced these values into the model and perform scenarios. Essentially, we used two channels. One was in capital and production, productivity, decreasing it. And the second was decreasing direct support via trade in transport services. We used the static model. We have done several trials, and in this case we use the results I'm going to present, which are the ones that we find reasonable. Those are results from the static with not a long-term closure, a normal closure. And we have two assumptions. What if China reduces subsidies? We can say that China could play with depreciation to keep its competitiveness as it is, and this is scenario one. But then we fixed. We made it possible that China cannot play with depreciation, so we fixed capital. And in this case, these subsidies, the money which is saved from these subsidies could take another form, and we can hypothesize that this could be a lump sum payment to consumers, to income, etc. And this is the second scenario. Here are some of the results. Well, I want to say, you will see that we have quite a strong disaggregation for manufacturing sectors, of course, and we have the main world actors here. What are the results from this first scenario, in which we assume that China reduces, eliminates, not reduces, eliminates the subsidies as they were estimated? We have a rather small decrease in China GDP, and a slight decrease in other partners. What we notice is that depreciation in China is almost 10%. So China is compensating from this partially, because terms of trade decrease as well, is compensating through depreciation, not completely. In the second scenario, when depreciation is not possible, we have made that constraint. We see that the impact on Chinese GDP is much higher, and that the worsened of terms of trade is 5.4. What happens are small adjustments in other countries, because of course China is a huge actor. In this case, China becomes competitive because it switches to productions, to producing sectors where it is indeed more competitive. Let's see here are the exports of China to the world, and we notice, for instance, that in the first scenario, where depreciation can be implemented, of course, exports decrease more and proportionally to the amount of subsidies in those sectors like wood. I have mentioned ferrous metals and metal products, and rubber, plastic, and motor vehicles and parts. But other sectors increase. Of course, there is transfer. It's a matter of efficiency, and there are big numbers, but certain sectors are very small. In the case where depreciation cannot be realized, of course, the impact we saw, it is much higher, and as well as the decrease in exports in those sectors for which the Chinese are currently exporting more, or are apparently much more competitive thanks to the subsidies. Instead, there are increases in other sectors, for which among which textiles, not textiles is still decreasing. It moves to forestry and other sectors. We need to look at this. And this is the change in exports. We saw the totals, and here we see that the greater decrease is the dotted line is a change in absolute values of total trade, total export of China, and we see that exports decrease much more in those sectors that are not more heavily subsidized, and we see how this changes in bilateral trade with the US and the EU. We see that in the case of the EU, the reduction of exports to the EU is lower than to the US for certain sectors, and we can see here two reasons. It could be that we know that both economies are highly integrated in value chains. We have not looked at in detail to how trading intermediates is behaving, but we can hypothesize that there is a combination of competitiveness vis-a-vis the EU and the presence of trade that is across supply chains. I don't know if I have time. I will show another graph, but essentially our preliminary concluding remarks is that subsidies in these sectors are essential for the competitiveness of China in world trade. And considering the estimate and the P factor, we can say that according to our simulation, more than 10% of China's export prices are explained by subsidies. As a consequence, obviously, China is not competitive in all sectors without subsidies. And if these subsidies would be wanted to be removed, this is very challenging in the modeling exercise. This amount of money that the country and the different governments at different levels are expended could be spent differently, perhaps less trade distortingly. We are not sure at all if it supporting domestic demand or domestic income. But one has to be reminded that given the importance of the country and its linkages and the fact that China is essentially a factory of the world, and if things change in the short term, this is not going to change. This will have consequences to other countries, as in one of my slides. I would stop here, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, thank you, Beatriz, for this very informative presentation. We now open the session for question. Okay. Oh, there you go. So we have a question from Eddy Bekkers. Well, first off, he said, very interesting presentation, Beatriz. So compliments to you. I was wondering, to what extent do the subsidy data collected reflect variation in lobbying across sectors?
Actually, you can think that the subsidies that we estimated depend a lot on how the industry how the different industries have behaved, have moved, because it's not easy to present a claim for to the government to execute a trade defense investigation. It's very difficult, and all the burden of demonstrating that the subsidies are harmful is on the industry. Then the investigation is performed by the countries. But there are, at least in Europe, I don't know in other countries, I don't know how it is in the USA, but in Europe, the union, the associations of industries they are very helpful to the small industries in claiming. I can give you examples of small sectors that in the area of solar panels, of parts of solar panels, they were helped. There was a small industry in Poland who was really supported by them, by the European, the associations, the sector associations. That said, also, if one wants to wonder and to improve the data, there is a lot to do also. There are differences across countries because the methodology to estimate the injuries are different. For instance, in the United States and in the USA, we have done a simple average, but we could think of ways of modulating or doing sensitivity, because in the EU, the injury is calculated applying a principle which is based on the facts available, because not every firm is willing to contribute and say and provide data on how much subsidies they have received. So in the EU, what is used as a proxy for those not cooperating is the highest value of the subsidy calculated for the other firms. I remind that this is done at the firm level. We have other let's say, ways of estimating the value of the injury, but to complement for that. But in the United States, for instance, they use the principle of adverse facts. So they punish those firms that do not contribute with countervailing duties that are over 100%. And this time we have chosen to do an average, but we could refine and make comparison for the same sectors across countries and improve that. And this will be also reflected in our data, surely. And as you saw, the highest values are for iron and steel, and the higher number of investigations are in those sectors. So we could go deeper in those sectors as well. I don't know if I have answered to your question, Eddy, and I hope so. You seems to be nodding.
Okay, thank you, Eddy. Are there any other questions from anyone? I have a question I'm not supposed to ask, but I'll pose it now. So earlier you said there was in the modeling you were doing some shocks on services trade. I didn't quite understand how you implement that, and perhaps what is the rationale behind that implementation?
Perhaps Alessandro could come in and explain how he settled the model. Ale, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I am. No, I mean, first we didn't touch at all services because the subsidies are supposed to be, I mean, the one we computed are mainly in the manufacturing sectors that probably you have seen in the slides, but mainly manufacturing sector from textile till other transportation. And then the rationality clearly is an approximation because we don't know exactly how these subsidies are working in reality in China. So we don't know if subsidy to production, subsidy to insurance, subsidy to capital loans, are subsidies to infrastructure for trading or trading services, whatever. So mainly we split the value 50-50, which something is going to support the production, and the other is supporting the export. For production, we introduce as a subsidy by alter tax. We change a little bit the tax on output, the TO, and then it was create a new version, new database. And then for the simulation, we could try that the other small part on production was a negative shock on capital productivity, for half of the amount to production. And the other side was on productivity on transport services, because as you know, it's linked to the amount exported. So we assume that China is subsidizing this sector by trade facilitation. Clearly, this is not exactly probably what is going in the real world. But I mean, if you have any suggestion how to improve the modeling, model when come. But the idea is to look at the results, and clearly there is another point, because the big point for me is not how we plug these subsidies. We have also the interesting paper for Anna that clearly we can really improve a lot the way we introduce in the model. But here the point is to try to understand which is the political economy, the trade policy by China, because clearly they are keeping their value at some level that imports are, I mean, somehow they can import with high appreciation currency, but then they can export a lower price without any depreciation policies. So the main point was to show that when you do these two simulation, and then if you keep the P factor exogenous, clearly we know that again the P factor is not the best because there is no inflation, there is no nominal, but that's not the point. The point is to see how big different in the two simulation, which means that first we have to better understand how to model in a more appropriate way. But the point is, so what is the value of these subsidies? And when we fix the P factor, so we assume that there is no chance for China to make any trade policy. So it's a sort of, okay, we don't have these subsidies working. What is going on? And then clearly the impact is huge. At the same time, we also know that these subsidies are a sort of capital. So in any case, we should also assume if China is not using this capital to subsidize sectors, I mean, so probably China could use this capital to subsidize the domestic demand. And then again is the rationality in fixing the P factor, because this capital is there. We cannot assume that China can just, this capital can just disappear. So it's a choice by the Chinese government, and then clearly you can move to lump sum out to household, you can move to support government demand, you can move on any domestic policy, or you can move to the trade policy. And that is the kickoff of the working we are going. Clearly, this is the first step, because the second step, because the very first step was to compute the equivalent, the ad valorem equivalent, and now we are moving the modeling, and clearly all suggestions and comments in this session, also after more than one come, because clearly that is another point, how to model, how to improve the modelization. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, it's of course, if you distribute the shocks or the subsidies to different sectors, the gains will be different, because the gains will not be directed towards the industry for which the subsidies being given, but we don't know really if the subsidy goes in full to that industry or somewhere else, right? Yeah, thank you. Okay, are there any more questions or comment suggestions? Someone is just connecting, so okay. Well, all right. So we're right on time to close the session, which is 1 minute before 7:43. So it was perfect. Well, thank you everyone for joining this session on agricultural and industrial subsidies. We had 3 very informative and very interesting presentations and discussions. So thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you to Anna, Kim, and Beatriz for your participation, and then for providing a very informative presentation. All right, well, thank you, and we'll now close this session unless there is a burning question from anyone. All right, well, thank you so much, and then
Bye-bye.
we'll see you in other sessions.